Yes, Ms. Boswell.
This afternoon, sir, we have two police witnesses. The first is Ian McCurley. May the witness be sworn.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Mr. McCurley, stand or sit as you wish, but most people are sitting.
Thank you.
Can you give your full name, please?
Yes, it's Ian Henderson McCurley.
Mr. McCurley, you joined Wiltshire Police in January of 1992.
That's correct, yes.
You were a uniformed police constable and you retired in 2021 in the rank of temporary police sergeant. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
You attended Charlie Rowley's address on the evening of the 30th of June of 2018, and you helped transport him to hospital. Is that right?
That's correct, yes, ma'am.
You had no involvement in the response to the Skripal's poisoning in March of 2018?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Before I ask you about your events in the response to Charlie Rowley's poisoning, I'm going to ask you a bit about your training on nerve agent poisoning. You have filed two statements with the inquiry. We don't need to look at them in detail right now, but I'm going to ask that they be pulled up. References 004549. Do you recognize that document as your statement that you gave on the 31st of July of 2018?
Yes, I do, ma'am.
And have you had a chance to read it again?
Yes.
And is that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
It is. You also prepared a second statement for the inquiry, and that reference is 6088. If that could be pulled up, please. Do you recognize that document there?
Yes.
And is that the statement that you prepared more recently to assist the inquiry?
Yes, it is, ma'am.
Have you had a chance to read it before giving evidence today?
Yeah.
And is it true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, it is.
Yes. Sir, may both of those statements be adduced into evidence?
Yes, they may. Mr. McCurley, don't forget that people have got to hear you.
Sorry.
That's all right, but just keep your voice pitched up a little bit for us, please, if you can.
The statement can be taken down now. And so, dealing first with your training on nerve agent poisoning, you received no formal or informal training from Wiltshire Police on nerve agent poisoning following the poisoning of the Skripals in March of 2018. Is that right?
Yeah, no, I received no training regarding that.
Okay. And have you received, or had you received training on nerve agent poisoning at any other point?
No.
Are you familiar with the 1, 2, 3 step guidance?
I would say no.
No.
This is ambulance guidance, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
To give you some context, we heard from a paramedic, Ben Channon, today, that because Charlie Rowley was the second patient that day that had been attended to at the address, that he approached with caution, with full PPE, and that was in line with the 1, 2, 3 guidance. But that's not guidance that you were familiar with.
No, I wasn't familiar with that guidance.
Okay. I'm now going to turn to your role in the response to Charlie Rowley's poisoning. On that day, you were on mobile patrol that evening with Police Constable Steve Porter. Is that right?
That's right, ma'am, yes.
And you were working a shift from 5 p.m. to 3 in the morning as a temporary police sergeant, covering Amesbury and the Tidworth area of Wiltshire. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
And I'm here taking this from your first statement. If you've got it in front of you, you can refer to it at page 1. You were responsible for the supervision of 3 to 4 officers, providing them with advice and direction, and your line managers were Duty Inspector Beresford Smith, from whom we will hear later on this afternoon, and FIM, which I believe stands for Force Incident Manager Andrew Noble. Is that right? Okay. You were made aware of a log relating to a possible drugs overdose at 9 Muggleton Road on that evening. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Can I ask you, before you arrived at the scene, do you recall what you had been told about the incident?
I was aware that a male called Charles Rowley had been taken ill at the address. It was a suspected overdose. I was also made aware that a female had been taken from the address earlier.
Sorry, I'm awfully sorry, Mr. McCurley. I missed the last bit. You were aware that a man called Rowley had been taken ill and a suspected drug overdose.
Yes.
And?
A female had been taken from the address earlier that day at approximately 11 o'clock.
Thank you.
Well, that was the extent of it.
Was that the extent of the information you had?
At that time, yes.
Did you know who she had been?
I didn't know at that stage, no.
Did you know anything about the symptoms of Charlie Rowley at that stage?
No, I didn't. As I said, it was described as a suspected overdose at that stage.
Okay. Can we pull up, please, document 006117 and at page 10, please. Mr. McCurley, this is a statement prepared by Deputy Chief Constable Paul Mills. He describes the information received by Wiltshire Police. Yes, and at paragraph 38, there we go, and it's page 10, paragraph 38. And here, Officer Mills is describing the information that had been received by the police. He says, at about 7 o'clock, a call was received into the communications center from the ambulance service, querying whether Wiltshire Police were aware of a special job. During the call, the ambulance service informed the call handler that they had attended an incident at the same property earlier that day and had dealt with an individual with respiratory arrest and severe breathing problems. That patient had been taken to SDH. They were now back at the property and dealing with 2 further patients displaying excessive drooling, sweating, and who were unresponsive and making really weird noises. The ambulance service stated that there was to be a significant response from them and the fire service. Then if we just turn over the page, I'd like to draw your attention to paragraph 41. So a little later, the ambulance service made further contact with the communication center and stated that patients were presenting with similar symptoms to the Salisbury incident. The fire service were now in attendance and were treating the incident as if there was a suspicious substance at the location. The ambulance service requested that cordons were put in place and for a police commander to lead with a fire ambulance a Jessup response, and the police call handler stated that this would be added to the log and passed to their boss, who was the force incident commander, that was Mr. Noble. Yeah. Was this information passed to you before you arrived at the scene?
No, it wasn't, no. The only information I had was I had a call from Inspector Noble he was of the opinion that it was a...
Sorry, can I just ask you to keep your voice up? You had
sorry.
a call from
He
Noble.
had a call from Inspector Noble. He was of the opinion that it was a drug-related matter and that we should treat it as such initially.
He was of the opinion it was a drug-related matter and it should be treated as such initially. Okay. Did you agree with his assessment that it was a drugs-related matter?
Yes, I did.
You did, okay.
I'm sorry, at what point did you reach that conclusion? Or maybe we're going to come to it.
Yes.
You're being asked about the initial time when Mr. Noble told you that he thought it was drugs. Did you have any information at all at that stage?
At that stage, I took his word for it.
Yes.
He'd said he'd done some research and, on the address and the persons within the address, some of the persons within the address, and that was drugs intelligence pertaining to that address and to the people.
So he said he'd
A couple of the people within the address.
Thank you.
So at that stage, you were taking his word for it.
Confirmed, yes.
You didn't know, we've established that, what information the police, the paramedics or the fire service had.
Not at that stage, no.
I see. Can I also ask, at page 1 of your statement, you say that I agreed with that initial assessment, and it was his feeling that we should not, that we should treat it as such, and that we should not let it escalate to the degree that it seemed to be escalating to. This escalation, did you agree with him about that you shouldn't let it escalate, that you should try to prevent that?
No, I thought that we should make some more inquiries at the scene and try and get some more information relating to the call. I was aware that a cordon was already in place, and at that stage I thought that was sufficient.
That a cordon was in place, is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay. So at this stage, you knew that there was a cordon in place, and you thought that that was
Sufficient, yes.
sufficient. Did you know that, or did you believe that they were closing down roads and so on?
Yes, I'd heard that on the radio, I think from PC Boston, that he'd asked for more units to the scene to help close down roads.
I see. So before you arrived, you heard from PC Boston on the radio that he required more police units.
Yeah.
Yes. To assist with scene management and closing the roads.
That's correct, yes.
And so you wanted to have more information before a decision was taken to close the roads. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Now I'd like to ask you, once you arrived on the scene, was that was together with your partner, Steve Porter, is that right?
That's right, yes.
Okay. And when you arrived, is it correct that the fire service were already there?
Fire service were there and some paramedics.
Okay. Did you speak to anyone from the fire service?
I spoke to one and asked him where the person in charge was. He didn't know, so I spoke to a paramedic at the scene, and he informed me that the two paramedics inside the address thought the symptoms that Charlie Rowley was displaying were similar to those of the first original incident in Salisbury.
Okay. I can just pause you there. When you spoke to the fireman and you asked him who was in charge,
Yeah.
did you follow that up at all, trying to find the person who was in charge at that stage?
No, because I then spoke to the paramedic.
And did you get the paramedic's name?
I didn't know.
Did you get the impression that he was in charge of the paramedic response?
No, I mean, at that stage, I thought he was just a paramedic. I didn't know what his position was, if he was in charge, or I thought he was just another paramedic who had arrived at the scene.
I see. But you spoke with him and he told you that the paramedics inside thought that the symptoms being displayed were similar to the earlier poisoning in Salisbury. Is that right?
Yes.
When you heard that information, did you relay that back to Inspector Noble or anyone else at the police control room?
No, I didn't. I was working on the assumption that they already knew that. I knew the control rooms had been talking to each other, so I was working under the assumption that he already knew that.
So you thought that the police would already be aware
Yes.
that the paramedics were of the view that that the symptoms were similar?
Yes.
We know that you came to search the flat.
Yes.
Can you tell us what conversations you had with colleagues before that decision was taken?
I spoke to Steve Porter and we discussed what we were going to do. He's a colleague there. I made the decision that we would go within the cordon to speak to a male called Sam Hobson, who I'd seen outside the address and was a possible witness. I knew he had connections to the address.
Can I just pause you there? So you saw Sam Hobson, you recognized him.
Yes.
Have you had dealings with him previously?
Yes, I have.
Can you just tell us briefly what those dealings were?
I can't remember specific dealings, but I've known him a number of years since he was a teenager. I know him to be involved in drugs, on drug use. I know he's a drug user. So, yeah, I knew him personally, but I can't remember the specifics of how I dealt with him.
Okay. You saw him at the address, so he was on the other side of the cordon.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
You would have been outside the cordon. So you went through the cordon to speak to him. Is that right?
Yes.
And what did you ask him? What did he tell you?
I asked him where he'd been that day, or if he'd taken any, substances, or Charlie had taken any substances that day. He said that he'd been to a hog roast with Charlie Rowley. They'd been in and out of the flat a couple of times. Charlie might have taken some methadone, but as far as he was aware, he hadn't taken anything else or any fentanyl. I asked the question if he'd taken any fentanyl.
Can I just pause you there? Why did you ask him specifically about fentanyl?
Because I'd had a conversation with... I'm not sure if that conversation took place before I spoke to Inspector Noble or afterwards, but he had mentioned fentanyl and thought it might be fentanyl within the flat.
Was fentanyl, as it were, a topical subject at the time or not?
Not specifically.
No.
It's okay. Carry on.
Fentanyl wasn't a particular problem at the time, but it was something that Inspector Noble had mentioned to you. Is that right?
We'd had a conversation that he thought it might be fentanyl, and that if we did go into the flat, he'd done some research and thought it would be safe for us to enter the flat to conduct a search.
Before we get to the search of the flat, did you know that the paramedics who were inside had been asked to search the flat?
No.
We heard this morning from Ben Shannon that they had been asked to search the flat for drugs paraphernalia and that they found some syringes, in fact, in the kitchen. This is before you entered. I take it then that you weren't aware that that had happened.
No.
When you spoke to Sam and he said that Charlie might have taken methadone, but that he hadn't taken fentanyl as far as he was aware, did that alter your assessment that this was an opiate overdose?
No. I mean, I didn't know whether to believe Sam or not. I thought he might be protecting Charlie.
If I can just pause you there, you thought he might be protecting Charlie, is that
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And I assume that by that you mean protecting him by not disclosing...
Disclosing any information to us.
Yes, about illicit drug use. Did you take any steps to reassure Mr. Hobson about that?
Yes, I explained that he wasn't in any trouble, Charlie wasn't in any trouble, we were only trying to help and ascertain if he had taken anything that might have caused him harm, or there was any other explanation.
In your statement at page 2, your first statement, it's recorded that you spoke to Andy Noble, Inspector Noble, and that you both agreed that it was a drugs overdose of some description. And there it says that you remember speaking with him about the possibility of fentanyl, and he said he'd done some research and said that if we took the right precautions, then it would be safe to enter the flat, and that you agreed that it was safe. Do you remember that?
Yes.
When you decided to enter the flat, did you have a clear idea of why the ambulance and the fire service were treating the incident with such caution?
Well, I knew from what the initial paramedic had told me that they were under the impression that it was similar to the first incident to Salisbury, yes. And
you were under the impression that it was related to fentanyl. Is that right?
I was under that impression that it was related to some sort of drugs overdose in some capacity. And as I said, I had previous knowledge of Sam Hobson, had previous knowledge of Charles Rowley. I'd been to the sudden death of his previous girlfriend from a drugs overdose a couple of years earlier. I knew there was intelligence regarding drugs on the flat. I knew there was no obvious connection to Russia, if you like, from within the flat. These were all local people. I knew, we were some months from the original incident in Salisbury, and we were 8 or 9 miles away from that incident. So those were the reasons that I thought possibly it was a drugs-connected incident.
You made the decision to enter the flat.
Yeah.
We know from the evidence of Ben Shannon from this morning that the symptoms that Charlie was displaying when he arrived were not those that you would expect to see with an opiate overdose. He had increased muscle tone, a lack of reaction to the naloxone, and the behavior that Charlie was exhibiting was very different to what Ben had seen with drugs cases before. At that stage, you hadn't had any direct contact with the paramedics inside the flat to ask them about the situation. That's right, isn't it?
I went into the flat.
But if I can just before we get into that stage where you go inside,
Yeah.
I suppose what I'm saying is they had that information in there.
Yeah.
They had been asked to do a search. Was there any way for you to get in touch with them without physically going into the flat yourself?
No, I don't think so, not at that stage. I don't know if they... No, they were busy with the patient, so I would have thought that highly unlikely.
Did you make any efforts with your control room to see if it would be possible to be in direct contact with them?
No.
Do you agree in hindsight that you should have spoken with your colleagues in the ambulance service before making an assessment that it was safe to enter the flat?
Yes, in hindsight, I think that would have been a better idea to try and speak to them on the telephone or radio, yes.
Now, you and your partner, Steve, made the decision then to go into the flat. What precautions did you take before entering the flat?
The only PPE that we had were gloves, which we put on before we went into the flat. The flat door was wide open, the windows were wide open, it was well ventilated, but that was the only personal protection that we had.
And you entered you went up the stairs and then you entered the kitchen living room, is that right?
Yes, I glanced off to the rooms either side as I went in. I think the door was slightly ajar, and it's at that point that I spoke to the paramedics within that room.
Okay. You entered the room and you spoke to the paramedics. Can you describe how Charlie Rowley was at that time?
He was on the floor. I think his head was facing the door, and he was making what I can only describe really as groaning noises. He was obviously in some distress and discomfort.
Did you notice, was he frothing at the mouth at that stage?
I didn't notice that.
You say that you spoke to the paramedics once you entered the flat. Do you remember what the conversation was about?
I remember they were insistent that it was he was presenting with the same symptoms as the Salisbury incident. They were quite agitated. They were obviously hot, tired, and were unsure as to how it was progressing, what was happening, and they hadn't had any contact from their control room. It seemed to be a lack of contact. Sorry.
With their own control room?
Yeah.
Okay. Ben Channon, in his statement, and sir, for your reference, we don't need to pull it up, but it's INQ 5542. He says that he told you and Stephen that you needed to put some protective clothes on before entering, and that you were quite dismissive of their concerns. If I can ask you firstly, did they warn you about protective clothing?
I don't recall that. We didn't have any protective clothing. We only had the gloves that were there. I didn't really go too far into the room. It was a conversation, as the door was ajar.
Ben Channon's evidence was that you weren't wearing gloves to begin with. Are you sure that you put them on before you entered the flat?
Yes.
Turning to the second part of Ben's statement, that you were quite dismissive. Do you agree that you were dismissive of their concerns at that stage?
Well, I'm sorry it's perceived that way. I didn't mean to be dismissive, and I'm sorry they've taken that way, but I was only asking the question whether, they thought it might be drug-related. But, when they answered no, they were quite insistent that it wasn't. It was, as per the Salisbury incident, then that was it.
Did they discuss with you why they thought it was similar to the Salisbury incident? Did they give any justification for that view?
Just that his symptoms were presenting as per the first incident.
Did you share with them your justification for believing it was an opiate overdose?
No, not at that stage, no.
After that conversation, so as it goes without saying, but you didn't believe that they were correct, did you?
I still thought at that stage it was a possible drugs overdose. But when I asked him the question and they were quite insistent, then I started to have reservations. So, because they were both very insistent and plausible that it was as per the first incident in Salisbury. So, in the back of my mind, I was beginning to think, well, is that the case? And it's something that I wanted to discuss with Marcus Beresford-Smith, who's the duty manager. I knew he was en route, so that was a discussion to be had with him.
In your statement at page 3, you said that you didn't believe that they were right. you thought it was a drugs overdose based on intelligence and personal knowledge of Charles Rowley. But are you saying now that you didn't think they were right, but at the back of your mind you had some reservations?
No, I initially asked the question. When I went in there, they were quite insistent that it was Novichok. I said, well, something to the effect of, we were under the impression it might be drugs related. What do you think? And they said, no. It's that stage that I began to think, well, I have some doubts, yes.
Lee Martin's evidence is that during this discussion, and for your reference, sir, it's INQ 5143, page 5. Lee Martin's evidence is that during this discussion, Ben Shannon told you, what gives you the right to question our clinical judgment? Do you recall being told that?
No. Sorry, is that one of the paramedics within the property?
Yes, that's right.
No, I've never questioned their medical judgment.
No, but did somebody say that you were? That's what's being asked. Did they complain that you were questioning their clinical judgment?
Sorry, I don't understand.
Did they complain to you that you were questioning their clinical judgment?
Not that I recall, no.
Right.
I see. Would you agree that it would be a clinical judgment, wouldn't it, of a patient if they were displaying symptoms of organophosphate poisoning?
Yes.
And you didn't have training on that poisoning, as we've established.
No.
Do you agree in hindsight that you should have given more weight to their clinical assessment of what was causing Charlie Rowley's symptoms?
In hindsight, yes. But as I said, I did start to have reservations, and it was something that, I wanted to discuss with the duty inspector as and when he arrived on the scene.
Did you pass along the paramedics' assessment that this was Novichok poisoning up your chain of command?
No, because as I said, I was aware that Marcus Murphy-Smith, the duty inspector, was en route and would be there shortly, so I was going to speak to him directly.
You said Marcus Beresford-Smith was en route, and then I didn't hear the last part.
I was going to speak to him directly.
I see. After your discussions with the paramedics, did you search the flat?
Yes, we made a cursory search of the flat, yes.
And can you describe for us what that cursory search involved?
It was just looking in the rooms. We weren't touching anything, we weren't lifting anything. It was just to look in the rooms and see if there's anything obvious regarding drugs, paraphernalia, or possible drugs within the flat.
I see. And I take it from that you didn't ask the paramedics whether they had searched the flat already?
No.
You didn't know they'd found
I didn't
syringes?
know they'd searched the flat, no.
Okay. Did you go into the bedroom of the flat?
Yes.
Okay. And the bathroom?
I believe so, yes.
Did you go into the kitchen and the living room?
The door was ajar, and I really spoke to the paramedics through that door, so I didn't go directly inside, no.
Okay. You've told us that you didn't have personal protective equipment, just gloves.
Just gloves.
Were you concerned at all that you might be putting yourself at risk?
We thought in that initial phase that it was a drug-related incident, and as I said, I'd spoken to Inspector Noble. He was on the opinion that it may be fentanyl, and he'd done some research on that, and that if we took the correct precautions, we would be safe. And those precautions were really make sure that the flat's well ventilated, the doors are open, the windows are open, don't touch anything inside, cursory search, don't touch anything that you didn't have to, basically.
I see. We know now, of course, that there was Novichok in the flat.
Yes.
and it was in the kitchen, in the living room, in the bathroom, and in the bedroom. In fact, it was also on the door handle, the inside door handle. It's really chance, isn't it, that you and your colleagues didn't become contaminated yourselves when you conducted that search?
On reflection, we were very lucky, yes.
After the search, you returned to the paramedics in the living room, and your conversations then turned to how to get Charlie Rowley out of the premises. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
And you and Steve decided to drive the ambulance since you were already within the cordon. Is that right?
Well, we'd had a discussion on the perimeter of the cordon, I think, with fire and ambulance, because they were of the opinion that they needed to get a specialist team in to assist with the paramedics to get Charles Rowley out. And they asked us if we would assist, as we were already within the cordon and possibly contaminated. So we agreed to that. We helped, they put him on the trolley, and we helped carry it out of the premises.
You had a conversation with Kerry Laws on the phone. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
With whom?
Kerry Laws.
Who is?
I think she was a DS, detective sergeant at the time.
Right.
Yes. So we will hear from Miss Laws. She will be giving evidence to the inquiry.
Yes.
So can you help us? That conversation with her on the phone, that happened after the search, is that right?
Yes.
And what did she tell you?
She was trying to get hold of, or been in conversation with a consultant, was trying to get more information, and would get back to me when she had some more information as to possible causes.
Okay, I can just pause you there. So she was trying to get more information from a consultant treating whom?
Dawn Sturgess.
I see. You spoke to her on the phone. She said she would try to get the information and she'd get back to you. Did she get back to you?
Yes, not long after that, I had a telephone call from her. She said she'd spoken to the consultant, and his perception was, or his thoughts were, that it was a drug-related incident.
If we can just go to the statement, which is INQ reference 4549 at page 4. And 3 paragraphs from the bottom, we have the beginning of your conversation with Marcus Beresford Smith. Do you see that?
Yes.
You say, I went back downstairs, and because Marcus Beresford Smith was arriving, because he was arriving at the scene soon, I wanted to speak to him. When he arrived, he immediately came into the cordon, which upset ambulance and fire crews, and I remember him having a discussion with them. He felt that it was a drugs overdose and was trying to impress upon the other agencies that because of the intelligence, that is what we felt. Did you speak with Marcus Beresford Smith and tell him about your discussions with the ambulance paramedics in the flat?
I can't honestly recall that. I remember having a conversation with Marcus, but I think at that time I'd already received the phone call from Kerry Laws to say that she'd spoken to the consultant, and it was that they felt it was related to drugs overdose.
Okay. So after you heard from Kerry Laws, were you pretty firmly of the view that it must be a drugs overdose at that stage?
Yes.
After the incident, you spoke with Marcus Beresford-Smith. After you left the scene, is what I mean. You went through what had happened, and both you and Marcus were quite happy with your assessment of what it was, and you were happy that the doctor also agreed that it was a drugs overdose. Is that right?
Yes.
You also say in your statement that you felt you might get a complaint from the fire service.
That's correct, yes.
Do you remember thinking that?
Yes.
And why did you think you would get a complaint from them?
I know when Marcus came to the scene and he crossed over into the cordon, they weren't very happy about that. And obviously, initially, I had got into the cordon, and I felt the paramedic wasn't happy with what I'd done at that stage.
A pre-hospital care expert has been instructed by the inquiry to consider the care given to Charlie Rowley, Don Sturgess, and the Skripals. That expert is critical of the police response to Charlie Rowley's poisoning. If we could pull up inquiry reference 5942, page 69, please. And I think you've got it on your screen there. Paragraph 5.32. I'll just read it out. The expert says, at any serious or major incident where there is a multi-agency involvement, the Joint Emergency Services Interoperability Protocol, JESIP, is a standard protocol in order to ensure clear, concise, and timely communication between all responding organizations on scene, and to ensure a joint understanding of risk awareness and incident management. JESIP principles are embedded into organizational learning and training, and incident commanders should make decisions jointly. The JESIP principles appear at the report, Appendix 2. I think you've seen that just before giving evidence. The key aspect of this is that decisions should be made jointly and collaboratively. The expert says, I find the actions of PCIM, that's you, Ian McCurley, and Inspector, that's Marcus Beresford-Smith, in somewhat disregarding the clearly held clinical concerns of the ambulance clinicians, based on the ambulance clinician's clinical assessment of Mr. Rowley, to at the very least have lacked a level of professional respect. Do you agree, in hindsight, that your actions when you attended Charlie Rowley's poisoning did lack a level of professional respect for your ambulance service colleagues?
To a degree. I mean, that wasn't my intention. And on reflection, yes, I should have adhered to the JESIP principles. But at that stage, I didn't think we were dealing with a major incident. I thought it was a suspected drugs overdose. So that was the rationale behind that. But either way, I could have liaised with fire and ambulance and given our rationale for what we did and presented that better, yes.
Yes. If we look at Appendix 2 of the report, which includes the JESIP principles of joint working, it's page 85.
We've heard a fair bit about JESIP, Mr. McCurley. At the time, what did you know about those principles?
Well, I'm aware that it's a set of principles agreed by emergency services to be used at a major incident.
And they amounted to what?
Co-location, communication, situational awareness,
Okay.
Control rooms talking to each other.
Okay, thank you. Then
Yes.
you knew that.
So we have now up on the screen the helpful diagram that the expert includes in his report. So co-locate with other responders as soon as practically possible at a single, safe, and easily identified location. So when you arrived on the scene, I suppose the Jessup principles would suggest that you should have co-located with the commanders of the fire service at that stage and the paramedics together. Communicate using language which is clear and free of technical jargon. Coordinate, jointly understand risk. So in this case, I suppose that would be jointly understand risk by sharing information about the likelihood and potential impact of threats and hazards to agree appropriate control measures. Do you agree that when you arrived at the scene, had you applied the Jessup principles, you would have had a greater understanding, certainly before searching the flat, of the potential hazards there?
Yes.
And we know that if you had had that communication with the paramedics, who at that stage had formed a view about Charlie Rowley's symptoms, they had actually already searched the flat and found syringes, that it really wouldn't have been worth the risk of you entering the flat to do that second search.
As I said, on reflection, it's something that we should have done.
I see. Thank you very much, Mr. McCurley. If you just wait there, there will be some.
Okay, thank you.
Just before you go any further, Mr. McCurley, you told us, I think, that you made a cursory search of the flat, looking rather than touching.
Yes.
Is that it? But you went into the bedroom and the bathroom. Did you find or see anything of any significance or not?
I saw some sharp bins and some needles.
Sharp bins?
Yes.
Yes.
And some needles. That was all.
Right. And they were, yes, all right, in a drawer, in a cupboard on the side where?
From recollection, I think the needles were in a wardrobe, possibly. Without reading my statement, I can't say. And the sharp bins were beside the bed.
Beside the bed. All right, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Mansfield. I represent the family of Dawn Sturgess.
Hello.
And I want to just follow up on the question of hindsight and response to a dangerous situation, potentially. That's the area. If you're facing a situation that is potentially dangerous, in other words, it might be, you have to take great care, don't you?
Yes.
You agree?
Yes.
Sorry, if you could kindly speak.
Yes, I agree.
It's very difficult to hear. And if you're told by responsible public officials, in this case, ambulance crew, and more, because there's more behind them, that this involves a dangerous matter, namely something they've seen before, you've got to be very careful, haven't you?
Yes.
You've nodded. You mean yes?
Yes.
I'm so sorry. I'm doing it because it has to go down. You were not in a stronger position than they were you? To assess that this was not a dangerous situation, were you?
Not at that time, but I felt there was evidence that could have been gained by speaking to the witness and possibly going into the address.
Sorry, were you in a better position than they were to assess whether this was a dangerous situation?
Well, they were within the flats and treating the patient, so no.
No. You see, this is important for, again, I suggest to you, the future, if you run into this sort of situation again. Do you agree you had no materials at your disposal to suggest that they might be wrong altogether? You had no medical training, do you agree?
No, I've got no medical training, no.
Had you had any experience of Novichok?
No.
Well, you weren't involved in Salisbury?
No.
I put it generally. And just to follow the gaps, before you ever got to Amesbury, that's after the Salisbury incident, do you accept there'd been no training for police officers about Novichok, is that right?
No, there'd been no training, no.
None. Let alone how you distinguish Novichok from drugs. Had there?
No.
And one other matter. Before you went to Amesbury, were you aware that there might be more Novichok discarded in the Salisbury environment?
Before I went to the job at Muggleton Road, you mean?
I'm so sorry?
Before I went to the job at Muggleton Road.
Yeah, before you went to Amesbury and Muggleton Road, yes. In other words, between Salisbury and Amesbury, I mean the time interval, had anyone said to you as a police officer, we the police, whoever they may be speaking to you, believe there's a possibility that Novichok has been discarded. They wouldn't have taken it all back to Russia. They might have left some. Did anybody say that to you?
No, I don't recollect that, no.
No idea. So really, when you got to this address, you had no idea about any of these matters, did you?
Only the intelligence that we had.
You had, yes, your intelligence was different. I'm not questioning the intelligence you had. I'm questioning the process you went through here, because I want to suggest to you this wasn't hindsight at all. You were in a position where you were fully equipped to say, I defer to you. You're the medics. You've been to Salisbury. You know about these things. And there might be a risk to the public. Do you understand the reasoning?
Yes.
Right. And the reasoning is important because, as a police officer, you'll be very familiar with this. Is this right? Matters happen very quickly. You don't have a lot of time to think. Often, do you?
No, that's true.
You have to be ready and prepared. Do you agree?
Yes, agree.
And the problem here was that if the medics, I'm not even suggesting for the purposes of this, that even if they were right, but if they might have been right, a whole series of things fall into place, don't they?
Yes.
Yes. And the things that fall into place, they may be rather obvious. One is, you don't walk into the premises without protection. Agreed? If they might be right.
Well, I made that decision, so...
I appreciate that. You did make that decision. I'm suggesting, did you forget that you didn't know anything about any of this Novichok business?
No, as I said, I made that decision based on the evidence.
Yes, all
that we
right.
had. I can't say any more in regard to that.
As you've agreed, if they might be right, there might be a danger to the public and yourself.
Yes, I agree on that.
You agree with that? So what it means is, had you, as it were, just for once deferred to another authority, you would have put on your protective gear if you had any, and if you didn't, you wouldn't have gone in, you wouldn't have gone across the cordon, police officers wouldn't have got in the ambulance, and all the rest of it. All that would have followed, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Yes. And, of course, beyond that, do you agree in these situations it's necessary, without engaging in panic, to warn people, perhaps locally to begin with, that it's necessary to be careful? You use the right words. You appreciate that?
I don't understand that question.
Well, if you go to a scene like the one you went to, and you discover that there's a possibility by the professionals dealing with it that it might involve a dangerous substance, which is possible to be somewhere else because you haven't traced anything, you'd want to warn the neighbourhood carefully and sensitively that you might not do it yourself, but somebody in the police might be in a position to inform onlookers, people who open their windows, wonder what's going on. You're then in a position to carefully warn them, aren't you?
Yeah, well, there was a cordon across
Yes, I know.
Muggleton Road.
Appreciate it was a cordon.
Nobody was coming out of the address.
No, all right. But these are all the precautions, do you agree, that you have to take once you think it might be a dangerous situation?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Now, on top of that, after all this was over, in the sense of the night itself, I mean, have you all sat down at Wiltshire Police Headquarters and thought this through, you included? How could we have done things better? Have you done that?
No, I think we had briefings afterwards, but I don't think there was any formal, how could we do things better? No.
Does that surprise you?
A little bit, maybe.
I have one more question. And it's not quite as significant as these other ones. But during this episode, you've indicated that you'd come to a conclusion before you ever spoke to the medics. I'll put it medics generally, the paramedics inside. And one of the reasons was you said there was no way of contacting them. That's the point. I want to follow through. Now, I can ask it as an open question. Was there no means, I don't mean walking in there, obviously, was there no radio communication I'll give you an example, through your control room to their control room, saying, I'm outside, I want to come in because I think, blah, 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 and then you explain it.
Yes,
that is possible, isn't it?
That would have been possible for me to contact our control room, for them to contact their control room, yes.
Did you think of that? You've said no. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
You can stay unless you want to.
Okay.
So we have one more witness this afternoon, but I
Right.
think now would be an appropriate time to have a break, and then we can hear from Mr. Beresford-Smith.
Yes, well, 5 to 3 then, please.
Good afternoon.
Yes, Ms Whitelaw.
The witness be sworn.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Now, Mr Beresford-Smith, either stand or sit at your option. It's probably easier if you sit because that's where the microphones are.
Thank you, sir.
But when sitting, nearly everybody lowers their voice. Try and remember we've all got to hear.
Yes, sir.
Could you give us your full name, please?
It's Marcus David Beresford-Smith.
And you should have in front of you a copy of your witness statement, which should extend to 8 pages, dated the 15th of July 2018, and the reference is INQ 004999. Have you had an opportunity to read through that witness statement?
I have.
Are there any corrections you would like to make to it?
There's one correction I'd like to make, please, if I may.
Of course.
That is that it states in there that I heard information from the hospital direct from the consultant. That wasn't the case. I either heard it from Acting Sergeant McCurley or via our control room.
Thank you, and we'll make clear that point when we come to it in the statement. But subject to that, are the contents of the statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, they are.
Thank you, and sir, with your permission, the statement will be adduced in evidence
Yes.
and appear on the website. Could you give us your rank and current role, please?
I'm an inspector within Wiltshire Police, and my current role is I'm a FIM, which is a Force Incident Manager.
And what was your rank and role in June 2018?
I was an inspector at the time, and I was the duty inspector for south of Wiltshire.
So that included Salisbury and Amesbury.
Salisbury and Amesbury, all the way up to Chippenham.
And for how long had you been an inspector prior to that?
I was promoted to inspector in 2015.
Thank you. If you could keep your voice up so that
Certainly
we
will
can
do.
hear you. Thank you. And for how long had you been a police officer?
I joined Wiltshire Police in 1993, so currently I have 31 and a half years service.
So has all your service been with Wiltshire Police?
It has.
And did you have any involvement in the Skripal poisoning in March 18?
No, I didn't.
But were you at the time working in the Amesbury, Wiltshire, Salisbury area?
I was a duty inspector for south of Wiltshire, so I knew the incident had taken place, yes.
Were you here this morning for the evidence of Ben Channon, the paramedic?
Was that the one first thing this morning? No.
Sorry, no, the second.
Second one. Yes, I was.
And so did you hear his evidence about the fear and feeling in Salisbury at the time of the March events?
Yes, I did.
Was that also your experience?
I knew that obviously the local community, there was obviously a major impact to the community, and there was worry in the community, which was being addressed hopefully by people at senior level.
And presumably that worry was about Novichok, nerve agent, being found in the area.
It certainly was. There was lots of scenes ongoing at the time, and obviously that was a very visual display of what was happening.
Sorry, lots of
Scenes ongoing.
Oh,
at the
lots of
time,
places
so-
where you saw policemen.
Yes.
Yes, I see.
And did you have an experience similar to Mr. Channon, where members of the public would ask questions about whether officers had attended or ask questions about the incident?
Not direct to me, no. Police inspectors, so yes.
I'd like to move now to the events of the 30th of June. We've heard evidence from DCC Mills on... Were you contacted by the Force Incident Manager at the time in the control room?
Yes, I was.
And who was that?
I was Inspector Andy Noble.
And so he's an inspector. Is that an equivalent rank to you at the time?
Yes, it is.
Is there any seniority or precedence between the Force Incident Manager and the duty inspector?
We're of the same rank, but as the Force Incident Manager, you take an overview of everything that's ongoing within Wiltshire Police at that time.
So if the duty inspector attends a scene, would the Force Incident Manager be responsible for dealing with communications and intelligence, and the duty inspector be responsible for tactical decisions at the scene, management of the scene?
Under the gold, silver and bronze aspect of how we deal with scenes, the FIM, or Force Incident Manager, would probably take the place of a silver commander, whereas myself at the scene would take the bronze commander.
So when you were contacted by the FIM, what did he tell you?
He told me that there was an incident in Muggleton Road in Amesbury, that there were 3 casualties, and fire and ambulance were at scene, and could I make my way there?
And what did he say about the nature of the incident?
He stated that it was a potential chemical incident.
I'm sorry, is this his exact language?
I can't remember, sir, but
All right.
that's what I've...
An essential, a potential
Potential chemical incident.
chemical incident.
This is what I think you said in your witness statement. Page 1, I was informed that the ambulance service and fire brigade thought they had a chemical incident at the address, and I was required to attend as the duty inspector. I was told there were 3 casualties at the scene, and the fire brigade had declared it a chemical incident.
That's correct.
And that presumably would have been your recollection at the time you made your statement.
Yes.
And did you make your way to the scene when you'd finished completing some other duties?
I did. I was in Melksham at the time, and then I made my way to Amesbury.
And were you driving an unmarked Vauxhall Astra, call sign 401 at the time?
That's correct.
And did you arrive at approximately 20:49?
I did.
And there is evidence that the ambulance transporting Charlie Rowley to hospital left at 20:59. So is it your recollection you arrived about 10 minutes before that ambulance departed?
That's correct.
When you arrived at the scene, are you able to tell us which emergency services were present?
Both fire and ambulance were at scene. There was numerous fire engines and 1 ambulance that was parked outside 9 Muggleton Road.
And was there a cordon in place?
There was a cordon, some 50 yards away from the address.
And are you able to tell who placed that cordon, whether it was fire or ambulance or police?
I believe it was initially put on by fire and then assisted by police officers.
And what did you do when you arrived on scene?
I initially tried to find the fire commander, asked a number of fire officers where they were. They weren't able to locate that person, and therefore I decided the next course of action should be to speak to the officers that were at scene who could tell me more information.
So you attempted to find the fire commander by asking some of the fire officers.
That's correct.
Did you ask the fire officers themselves about the incident?
No, not at all.
Did you try to contact the fire commander by radio?
That's not possible through our systems.
So you can't call into your control system and say, I need to speak to the fire commander, I can't find them?
I could have done, yes. That would take quite a long time, unfortunately.
Did you think about trying to contact ambulance personnel?
No.
And so what did you do next?
I then made my way through the cordon to speak to Acting Sergeant McCurley.
So just to be clear, you didn't speak to the fire or ambulance before you went through the cordon?
No.
And where was Sergeant McCurley at the time?
He was stood outside of the address, near to where the ambulance was parked.
With whom? Anybody?
I believe it was PC Steve Porter was with him.
And was there also a male with them?
There was a gentleman by the name of, who I now know to be, Sam Hobson, there as well.
Did you know him at the time?
No.
So were you the senior police officer on scene at this point?
I was.
And notwithstanding that, did the fact that Sergeant McCurley and PC Porter, the fact that they were inside the cordon, give you encouragement to enter it?
No, not at all. By that stage, I'd been informed that there was not 3 casualties, but 2. The first one being in the morning, and the second one being a male within the ambulance. And therefore, because of the CPRN, which is principles, because there was 2 casualties, I could enter, but under caution.
So it was in your mind, was it, the 1, 2, 3 protocols that we've heard about?
Yes,
That if there are 2, you would proceed with caution, is that correct?
that's correct.
So is that a cautious thing to do, to enter a cordon?
I literally entered 20 yards into the cordon. It was in the open air, and there was no other persons around apart from those described.
But it was a cordon you thought had been set up by the fire brigade,
That's correct.
and you hadn't been able to speak to them to ascertain why it was they had put a cordon of that extent.
That's correct.
So is it fair to say that at the time you breached the cordon, you didn't have a clear understanding, either from the ambulance service or the fire service, why they were treating this incident with such caution?
Not at that time.
Are you aware of the term blue light huddle?
Absolutely.
And does that reflect the Jessup principles, whereby the emergency services should co-locate, communicate, coordinate, jointly understand risk, and gain a shared situational awareness?
Yes, I am. Obviously, I tried to find the fire brigade commander, but wasn't able to. And now I know that there was no ambulance commander at the scene at that time.
But there were 2 ambulance personnel at the scene.
Yes, they were busy treating the casualty in the back of the ambulance.
And Sergeant McCurley had spoken to them, though.
That's correct.
What did Sergeant McCurley tell you when you went through the cordon to speak to him?
He told me that ambulance crews considered this could be a Novichok incident, and that while he was in the address, he saw drugs paraphernalia within the address.
So he told you that ambulance crew thought this was a Novichok incident.
Could be.
Or it could be.
Could be, sorry, yes. And that they had seen drugs paraphernalia in the address.
That's correct.
In your statement, I think you refer to Sergeant McCurley saying that there was only 1 casualty at the scene, but there'd been a female casualty, but that was earlier in the day.
That's correct.
We've heard Mr. Channon's evidence today about his convictions that this was nerve agent poisoning. Did Sergeant McCurley convey that to you?
As I said, he conveyed that it could be a Novichok incident.
Perhaps I can put it another way. Did he express how, in his words, insistent the paramedics were that this was a nerve agent poisoning?
Not at that time.
Going back to the 1, 2, 3 training then, does that apply to all blue light services?
It comes under the CBRN training, so all should be aware of that, especially at commander level.
But certainly from your perspective, it applies to the police.
Yes.
And with that guidance, do you understand the numbers when you count the 1, 2 or 3 patients have to be counted at the scene, or could that be a second patient, as we see here, 1 in the morning, 1 in the evening?
I think it could be taken that it could be at any time affected by similar circumstances.
Did Sergeant McCurley tell you that he'd certainly initially agreed with Inspector Noble that they thought this was a drugs incident, possibly fentanyl?
No, I had a completely open mind as to what was happening. I had been informed of the intelligence around the address and Charlie, but as to what was actually happening here, I was open-minded as to what needed to be done.
Sorry, so was your answer that he did tell you that about his earlier conversation with Inspector Noble when they'd agreed that it was a drugs incident, or did he not tell you that?
No, he did not.
Well, at some point, you obviously learned something about intelligence concerning the address and the people.
I certainly did, sir.
Before you got there, or when you arrived, or what?
Before I got there, sir.
Before you got there.
Did Sergeant McCurley tell you that he had reservations about it being a drugs incident now that he'd spoken to the paramedics?
No, he didn't.
What action did you take next? And if you need to refer to your statement, I'm on page 2.
I decided that the cordons would stay in place until we could get confirmation from the hospital as to how they were treating the first patient.
So did you request that someone from CID should attend the hospital?
I requested CID attend the hospital and speak with the consultants, but I think, sir, that I did that whilst I was en route to the scene.
To find out how the first patient was being treated, is that correct?
Absolutely, because it happened in the morning, so a few hours earlier, they may have had sufficient time to understand what happened with the first patient.
So do I understand your evidence correctly that at this point, when you've been inside the cordon talking to Sergeant McCurley, you're not treating the scene either as a drugs or nerve agent? You have an open mind?
I have a total open mind, yes.
Did you have a view as to which you thought was more likely at the time?
I thought it was more likely that it was going to be a drugs rather than Novichok.
And what was the basis for thinking that?
Purely the fact that Novichok is so rare, taking into account that we had obviously Salisbury a couple of months earlier.
What communications were there then with the hospital when you were at the scene?
I believe that the officers that attended the hospital called either the control room or Sergeant McCurley to give a direct update as to how they were treating the first casualty.
Sorry, which officers have spoken to Mr. McCurley, do you understand?
I think it was a DS...
Somebody at the hospital?
Yeah, the DS that attended the hospital.
Right.
Do you know the name of that DS?
Kerry Martin, I believe.
Martin.
Yes.
We know an Erin Martin.
Erin Martin, sorry.
And there's also a Kerry Laws.
Yes. Well, I've got the first names mixed up.
Yes. Do you know, was it both or either of those that you think went to the hospital?
I believe it's probably Erin.
So you think that Erin Martin went to the hospital and then called either the control or Sergeant McCurley?
Or she did both.
Or both, to relay back
Information from the hospital.
So
yes.
there wasn't direct communication with the hospital by you at the scene?
No.
Or by anyone else at the scene?
No.
As far as you're aware?
Not that I was aware.
And what was the information relayed to you, either by control or by Sergeant McCurley from the hospital?
The information was that they did not consider this patient to be suffering from a chemical incident, and there was nothing to indicate that the scene was hazardous.
Well, let me just break that down a bit. So the information is going from the hospital
Yes.
to Erin Martin or Kerry Laws, to either control and then Sergeant McCurley, or direct to Sergeant McCurley, and then to you.
Yes.
So do you accept there's room within that chain of communications for there to be uncertainty, ambiguity, conflicting accounts?
Absolutely.
in terms of what you think you did establish about those communications, you thought that the hospital didn't consider the patient to be suffering from a chemical incident.
That's correct.
Now, in terms of the statement that there was nothing to indicate the scene was hazardous, that's really not information from the hospital, is it?
No, it's not.
Was that information you were gaining from Sergeant McCurley?
I honestly can't remember whether that is the case or not, but I wouldn't ever...
Well, it is, isn't it, Ms. Whitelaw? If you're asking yourself whether there's a risk that Muggleton Road is contaminated, one of the things you'd quite like to know is whether the woman who was taken out of it in the morning was showing signs of chemical effects.
Yes, so that would be whether the patient had any signs of chemical contamination, yes.
But that would bear on the likelihood or unlikelihood, as the case may be, of there being anything contaminated at the house, wouldn't it?
Yes,
Or
indeed.
at least it might
No,
be.
I accept that point, sir.
Yeah.
Do you know if the possibility of nerve agent poisoning was discussed with the hospital consultant, who I believe is Dr. Jukes?
I don't know if it was absolutely discussed with him, but that was the reason why those officers attended.
Yeah.
At page 2 of your statement, you say, I was then told by control room there was police intelligence, and there's a redaction, but linking the address to drugs.
Yes.
Can I ask, first of all, did you know about the police intelligence in relation to drugs and the address before you attended or when you were at the scene?
As I was en route, I was informed of the intelligence.
Were you given any additional information about that at the scene?
Not that I can remember.
Now, there are reasons why the information is redacted. What we can say in this hearing is that Wiltshire Police had recent intelligence about Charlie Rowley's association with drugs. Is that your understanding?
That's correct.
Could we go to INQ 004989, please? Now, is this the police log?
Yes.
We see the 30th of June at the top, 1858. And could you clarify whether you would have had access to the log at the time you became involved?
I can always look up the log, but as I was travelling in a vehicle, obviously I wouldn't be able to view it.
So do you remember if you looked at it before you left?
No, I didn't. I don't believe so.
And do you remember if you consulted it while you were at the scene?
No, I didn't.
Thank you, that's helpful. So what we see here, just to remind ourselves, is that 1858 call, hazmat, hazardous material, 9 Muggleton Road. And the address there says antisocial behaviour, drugs. Is that, and do you understand that to be an indication that the address has been associated with those things?
Yes.
Now, we established with DCC Mills in his first tranche of evidence that the entry at 1919 on the log, I think if we could go down to page 2, thank you, arrived at scene was when officers were initially dispatched to the scene.
That's correct.
And we'll recall that that was after the fire and ambulance service had each called the police. And you said in your evidence you were called by Inspector Noble, the FIM, at 1925. I'd just like to look at the period leading up to that and the information police were receiving. So could we go to page 9 of this document? And 1908-36. Male is that resident noted as a Charles Rowley who has significant drugs intel and occurrence, assumes occurrences. And then we see a redacted section, police intelligence relating to Charlie Rowley. If we go to page 10, please. 1913. 49. Further call from ambulance stating patients have similar symptoms to Salisbury. Do you recall being told about this by Inspector Noble when he contacted you at 1925?
No, I don't.
Will he have had access to that on the log?
Yes, absolutely.
And then if we go to 1905, further down, next page, page 11 it might be. I'm looking for, I have spoken to, bottom of there, I have spoken to ambulance, and then super nervousness apparent as a result of op Fairline. This is understandable, however, address is linked to drugs, and my working assumption at this time is that the patient's presentation is most likely owing to drugs ingestion recently or preparation of the same. I suggest that a police supervisor attend and assess the scene before we start assuming the worst. Prompt unit to apply 1, 2, 3 safety advice and consider if a site survey by fire, who will have PPE, is appropriate before we start causing huge disruption with cordons and the like. Again, did Inspector Noble convey this information to you at 1925?
No, I think he was waiting for my assessment when I got there.
But whose note is this going to be?
That would have been Mr. Noble's as the force incident manager, sir.
So did he...
That's at 1919.
Did he prompt you to consider 1, 2, 3 safety advice, or was that something you realised by yourself when you attended the
Something I realised by myself.
And were you aware that it was envisaged at that stage that there might be a site survey by the fire scene brigade who will have PPE?
I was aware that they had that capability, yes.
But did you know that it was envisaged that they would conduct a site survey, some sort of survey?
No.
I assume? No. And they're there without underestimating the level of disruption that the Skripal poisoning brought to Salisbury. Do you think disruption is a factor which ought to carry particular weight when you're faced with trying to work out whether an incident is, as the fire and ambulance service was suggesting, a nerve agent poisoning, or, as Inspector Noble was thinking, a drugs incident?
I think we need to get that information first to see what we're actually dealing with before we disrupt the members of the public. Obviously, if we believe it was a Novichok attack, we'd have absolutely closed off as many roads as we possibly could have done to protect the public. But we need that initial information before we do that.
Do you agree that taking a precautionary approach in such circumstances is the most important thing, more than disruption and resourcing if there's a suspected nerve agent poisoning?
Yes, I do.
If we could go to page 12 of the same document, please. Thank you. Again, we see here there's redactions in relation to the police intelligence relating to Charlie Rowley. At 1922-38, it says, spoken to the fire commander, they have a person at the scene who's presenting the same symptoms that were present at Salisbury. And then we have further down, they are treating him with atropine as a precaution. And then we have believed to be Dawn Sturgess at the bottom. Can I just clarify with you, this is 1922, so it's before you were contacted by the FIM.
Yes.
So is that does that indicate that the FIM or control room seemed to have spoken to the fire commander at the scene?
It seems that an officer at the scene has spoken to fire, yes.
Was this conveyed to you a few minutes later by Inspector Noble?
No, it wasn't.
Do you think this would have changed your approach on arrival if you'd known about this?
Potentially, it was added to the information and intelligence that I would have had.
So 1922-38 is just before you're called by Inspector Noble. When you arrived at 2049, were you told about any drug paraphernalia being found in the property?
Yes, Acting Sergeant McCurley informed me that some had been found.
Yeah, said that.
Did that make you think it was more likely that this was a drugs incident?
Again, it added to the information and intelligence I was getting. I really wanted the confirmation from the hospital as to how they were treating the first patient.
So were the key pieces of information that you had the drugs intelligence you were told about en route, and then when you arrive, you're told that there's drugs paraphernalia, but you're aware there's a ambulance fire service being concerned about nerve agent poisoning, and you're waiting for results for the hospital?
That's correct.
So at that point, both were a possibility, is that correct?
It is, yes.
And if we go to page 19 of the log, you've said you arrived on scene at 20:49. There's an entry, SDH update, spoken to Stephen Duke. I think that should be Stephen Duke's consultant in charge. He is satisfied with the symptoms that Dawn is presenting in line with a drugs overdose, no risk of death at the moment. These are 2 drug overdose doses. So as we've heard from you, you didn't speak to Dr. Dukes yourself.
No, I didn't.
Did you think to do that?
No, that's the reason why I sent officers there directly. They can speak face to face with whoever the consultant was at the time.
With the only difficulty there is, of course, as we've explained, the chain of communication that then ensues in order for that information to get back to you.
Yes, correct.
When you have a blue light huddle, would you expect that to include a hospital in circumstances where there's a patient in hospital or not?
Not particularly. That's more around a different thing that we can do called Operation Link. But at the scene, it's usually the 3 blue light services that do that huddle.
Do you know what was said to Dr. Dukes by the officers who attended?
No.
We'll pick that up with the witnesses who attended the hospital, because one interpretation of the hospital being satisfied with the symptoms that are presenting in line with the drugs overdose is the police telling the hospital about drugs intelligence and the hospital saying it's consistent. But we'll have witnesses to address that. Do you recall any mention of the possibility of Dawn Sturgess's symptoms being consistent with organophosphate poisoning, such that it might be drugs cut with organophosphates?
Not that any drugs were cut with organophosphates. All I was told that she presented with similar symptoms to the second, and therefore they were linking the 2 instances.
Sorry, say that again.
Was there any conversation with you, by anybody, about the possibility of a drugs consignment or quantity contaminated with organophosphate?
No, there wasn't, sir.
That's not you.
Thank you.
Right.
Returning to your witness statement, if we could just go to it now, please. INQ 004999, page 2. You describe how the intelligence with the hospital's original analysis all appeared to fit together. With this information and no other information forthcoming, I decided that the scene would be treated as a drugs overdose.
From the police perspective, yes.
And we can see you made this decision before you were able to get hold of the scene commanders for fire and ambulance. Is that correct?
That was the decision I was going to make, and then went to have the huddle, as you call it, with the other commanders who had now arrived at the scene.
So you reached that as your, as it were, provisional police, your police conclusion. Did you add that you were then going to talk about it to the other commanders?
Yes, sir.
And
They
did
had
you?
arrived. Yes, I did, sir.
Ah. Right.
And Did you think about the fact that you hadn't seen Charlie Rowley yourself? Or had you seen him?
No, I hadn't.
So you weren't directly aware of how he was presenting. Had you heard about that from Sergeant McCurley?
That's correct.
And you didn't have a diagnosis for Dawn Sturgess's condition?
No, only that they were treating her as a drugs overdose.
And so did the huddle happen before you entered the property?
Yes.
And can you tell us about that conversation?
Obviously, following the Jessup principles, we got together and discussed exactly what was happening at the scene. I shared the information that I'd gathered and the intelligence that we had in relation to the address. And it was then put to them that the police were going to treat this as a drugs overdose.
And I can't find that in your witness statement. Do you think you haven't included the conversations with the fire and ambulance commanders, or can you point me to a...
It's page 2, it's the last paragraph.
Thank you. So this is moving on to just before the search commenced.
Yeah, it's before the ambulance left because we needed to make a decision what we were going to do.
Well, it does, unless I'm in the wrong place, Mr. Whitehall, it rather looks as if it is there at the bottom of
Yes,
page 2.
I'm just coming to it. Thank you. I had it slightly later on.
Yes, of course.
So you said that you make the decision that the scene would be treated as a drugs overdose, and you've clarified that was from a police decision.
Yes, it was.
At that point, I got hold of all the scene commanders for fire and ambulance. We all got together, and you passed the information you received on, and that we would be treating the scene as a drugs overdose and nothing more.
That's correct.
Did they agree or disagree with that?
The ambulance commander was accepting of that. Fire, not so much. But at that point in time, sir, they had the opportunity to declare a major incident if they so wished, which they didn't do.
Well, what's the next sentence of your statement? Second sentence of that paragraph, what does it say?
The second sentence,
Yeah,
from the decision,
go on, read it
the
out.
decision was that the scene would stay on, but that the fire and ambulance crews would leave the area.
Whose decision?
It was our decision after that huddle.
Ours, the police, or ours, the three of you?
It was after the discussions between the three of us that that decision was made.
Made by whom?
More than likely by myself. So.
Yeah, right.
Did the ambulance commander convey to you what we've heard in the evidence today from the paramedics, that their conviction that the symptoms being displayed were a sign of Novichok poisoning, or sorry, nerve agent poisoning?
No, he didn't.
But your account is that the ambulance commander was quite accepting of the decision to treat it as a drugs overdose.
That's correct.
But the fire commander was less so.
Yes.
What was the fire commander saying?
He was saying that the symptoms were similar to that of Novichok and that we should consider keeping the scene on.
But you didn't agree with that.
No.
And why was that?
Given all the information and intelligence that I had at that time, to treat this incident as a drugs overdose rather than any chemical incident or Novichok incident.
But you couldn't rule out nerve agent poisoning at that point, could you?
Couldn't 100% rule it out, no.
Well, in fact, you've got both a fire commander telling you about those symptoms, and you'd heard from Sergeant McCurley about those symptoms. So it wasn't just a question of ruling it out. There was a possibility that that was the explanation.
It's a possibility.
So thinking about it now, wouldn't it have been better to exercise more caution?
I don't think so, not along with the information and intelligence that I had at the time.
So moving on to the page 3, where you say the decision was then made to perform a cursory search of the property. Was that your decision?
It was. I was unaware that the property had already been searched by my colleagues who were already at the scene. If I had known that, we wouldn't have needed to research it.
Given the comments of the fire commander and the paramedics, did you not think it would be better for fire commanders with fire service with special protective equipment to conduct that search instead of police officers?
By that time, the decision had been made, sir, that this was being treated as a drugs overdose incident rather than anything more.
But should you not keep your decisions under review?
Yes, absolutely.
So you indicate in your statement that the basis of this decision was that we originally thought it could be a bad batch of drugs and wanted to locate them.
That's correct.
But I thought that you did, in answer to the chair's questions, indicate that you weren't considering drugs that had potentially been cut with something else.
Not, bad batch could mean many things. A batch of bad drugs could make just people ill, rather if they take the same quantity as they normally would do. It doesn't have to be laced with anything else in particular.
Oh, I see.
So when you refer to it in your statement, you don't mean a batch of drugs cut with organophosphates. You mean a batch of drugs that aren't pure and have something else that will cause problems. So was part of the reason for the search to look for something mentioned in the recent intelligence about Charlie Rowley's association with drugs?
Yes.
You say in your statement you were wearing your uniform and all appropriate PPE. Did that include a protective suit?
No, it didn't.
And did it include a face mask such as the one Mr. Channon described?
No, it didn't.
Did it include gloves?
Yes, it did.
And shoe coverings?
No.
Do you think now that out of caution, given that nerve agent poisoning hadn't been ruled out, that you should have waited to search to use CBRN procedures?
Obviously, with hindsight, sir, we wouldn't have gone into that address at all. But at the time, obviously with the information and intelligence that we had, I believed it was safe to do so. Obviously, I wouldn't put myself at risk or my colleagues.
How many officers went into that property?
It was myself, a PC Boston, and a special police constable.
LKD, is that right?
Yes.
And was it Sergeant McCurley as well?
No.
Not at that stage?
He had driven the ambulance to hospital.
Ah, yes, thank you. You say in your statement at page 3 that you entered the kitchen living area and noticed the sofa had been pushed to the wrong side of the room and that on the floor there was an uncapped syringe. Can you help us with this? Because we asked Mr. Channon about it this morning, and you'll recall his evidence that he hadn't seen a syringe. He accepted the possibility that although they try and clear up the medical equipment, there may be a syringe left behind. Are you able to say whether it was specifically a drug syringe from the house or whether it could have been medical equipment?
It could have been either. It was just a syringe, unfortunately, to me.
And what did you find when you searched in the kitchen?
We found other syringes and spoons associated with drug taking.
And we now know that there was Novichok found in the kitchen, not just in the bottle, but on the floor and around the sink in particular. We're going to hear evidence in this inquiry about how 2 Wiltshire police officers involved in the Skripal response became contaminated with Novichok despite PPE. So no doubt you appreciate now how dangerous that was to be searching that house.
Absolutely.
During the search, is it right that you found a packet of metazapine tablets and a packet of Zopiclone?
That's correct.
You'd better just tell us what you did find.
I found both of those.
No. You said you found some sort of paraphernalia.
Found some syringes, sir, and some spoons associated with drug taking.
Meaning? How do you know?
Through my experience of dealing with drugs
Because?
users, because there's deposits left on the spoon, etc. So,
Thank you.
I think you say burnt spoons in your
Yeah.
statement, and needles, is that correct?
that's correct.
On leaving the property, did you shut the windows and lock the door?
Yes, we did.
Did you speak to Sam Hobson, who I think was still at the scene?
I did, yes.
And this is page 4. What did he tell you?
He told me that he'd been with both Dawn and Charlie that day. Dawn had become ill and was taken to hospital. And that afterwards, himself and Charlie had taken further drugs and prescription medicine.
And did you leave the scene at about 10 o'clock?
I did.
When were you informed that the incident you'd attended was in fact a second nerve agent poisoning?
I believe not until the 4th of July.
And we've in fact heard evidence from Commander Murphy that by that stage counter-terrorism police had taken over following information from Porton Down that this was a Novichok poisoning.
That's correct.
So that concludes my questioning of Inspector Beresford-Smith, but before we end today, could I ask your permission to adduce the witness statement of Inspector Andy Noble? We've heard reference to the Force Incident Manager, that is INQ 006089.
Yes, all right.
Thank you very much, Inspector.
I've got a copy of it, haven't I?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, all right. Yes, are there any other questions for this gentleman?
I'm so sorry.
No, don't worry.
I thought there was a question coming. What the document says that's just been referred to is that there came a time after these events, on the 4th of July, the day that it was discovered that Novichok was the cause, or might have been a strong contender for the cause, pretty well confirmed. You were spoken to by the Chief Constable, weren't you?
I believe I was, yes.
Yes. Do you remember what you said?
I can't remember the exact words. I think I probably just relayed what had happened to him.
Sorry.
Relayed what had happened at the scene to him. So
Yes. Anything else?
I can't remember anything else specific.
I'd like you to think this is an important moment. Well, on the 4th. Appreciated the time lapse. Did you say anything about your approach to the whole of this matter that had happened when you went to the scene?
I cannot honestly remember even the conversations.
You see, what had been discovered is that it was Novichok, not drugs. And you had something to say, didn't you?
I can't remember
All
the
right,
conversation.
I'll put it to you straight away. You said you were, or you felt, professionally embarrassed. Is that right?
On reflection, sir, given that I made the decisions at the scene, which are obviously wrong, and which I need to apologise
Yes,
to Dawn and Charlie for,
That's
yes,
very,
it would have been embarrassing.
that's very significant, isn't it? Well, sorry. The reason I'm asking the question is not for an observation, but you see, you said you couldn't remember anything else. That's why I say to you, you'd forgotten a very significant observation that you'd made. Is that the position?
You're talking about hindsight, sir, I believe, and what my
No,
thoughts
no,
are.
I'm not talking about hindsight. You are. So please, had you forgotten about a significant observation you made to the Chief Constable on the 4th of July?
No, sir.
So I asked you carefully what else you may have said. So may I pass to the next question? If you did say words to the effect that you felt embarrassed, have you learnt any lessons from what happened on that day in which you were concerned?
I don't think I've learnt any particular lessons.
You don't think you've learnt...
Any lessons, as you...
No?
No, sir.
No lessons at all?
I think there's a number of learning that comes out of an incident like that.
All right, well, let's call it learning then. What learning have you got from what happened here?
I think the main learning would be the introduction of Jessup, which is now embedded within the force. That would be my main point.
So what difference would that have made?
I think the initial response to the scene would have made a difference.
What is the difference it would have made?
From the scenario and the information that I had at the time, I don't think it would have made any difference.
I'm not following you. You're saying it would have made no difference?
I don't think it would have made any difference to the decision-making that was made at the scene.
Well, I'm going to put this to you. I'm going to suggest to you it would make a lot of difference if police officers at the scene, I'm talking about you particularly as a senior one, and recognised there was a possibility of hazardous material, dangerous situation. That would have helped, wouldn't it?
I did recognise that, sir. I did then get...
That there was a possibility of a dangerous situation.
There was a possibility.
Yes, right. Now, and you recognised that at the time, so it's nothing to do with hindsight. You knew that then. Is that right?
I did recognise there was a possibility.
Yes, thank you. So, recognising the possibility that it was I'm putting it in short form, was a hazardous situation, what did you do about that?
My first action was to send officers to the hospital.
To the hospital? No,
check
the
on-
situation is outside the flat,
Yes.
not at the hospital. So, yes, all right. Yes, certainly.
You're saying you did what? Send people...
Send officers
What
to the
you're being
hospital.
asked is, what you're being asked is, given that you recognise, as you've now told me,
Yes.
at the time there was a possibility that there might be hazardous material about, what did you do about it? That's the question.
Well, at the time, sir, there was cordons already in place by the time I got there. I thought there was sufficient enough at that moment in time to deal with that situation until we got further information and evidence.
Yes, well, if it's hazardous, there is a hazardous group, HART. Were they on their way?
Hart weren't on their way, I don't believe. There was a
How,
fire.
yes, how far away were they?
I honestly don't know.
You don't know? No. So they could have arrived within a few minutes?
They could have done it.
Yes. You'd want to wait for them, wouldn't you?
Hart are the ambulance service rather than dealing...
All right. You say you had no information. You did have information which was coming from inside where the problem was, weren't you? That it was considered to be a chemical situation.
I was told that it could be.
Yes, that's all I'm dealing with, that it could be. Now, you had that information, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Right. And where you have a situation which could be of danger to the public, as well as first responders, you have a duty, do you agree, to ensure that precautionary measures or steps are taken?
Yes, sir.
Right. And you did the opposite, didn't you? Because you said, basically, officers go in, you go past the Novichok yourself. You may not have known that, but that's the point. You took the risks and put the public at risk, didn't you?
So no, I wanted to gain as much information and intelligence as I could before I made the decision.
Yes. What did you discover about Novichok?
In what way do you mean, sir?
that day, I mean, before you enter the premises, if it might be a dangerous situation similar to Salisbury, you wouldn't want to go anywhere near it until you'd found out about Novichok. Did you ask anybody about Novichok?
No, sir.
No. You didn't even ask the paramedics who'd been at Salisbury about... is that right?
Actually, they hadn't, Mr. Mansfield.
I'm sorry.
One of their colleagues had.
Yes, all right. Did you ask any of the paramedics, some of whom had been in Salisbury, dealing with it, who were at the premises, and there was a note on the log, we've seen all that. Did you ask anybody, such as that sort of person, about Novichok?
I didn't have the opportunity to speak to the ambulance crew as they were very busy working on Charlie.
Well, let's put it another way. You had radio communication with control rooms. You could have found out, couldn't you?
Could have found out
Yes.
everything that we knew about Novichok, yes.
So that instead of maintaining the cordon and employing PPE and all the other precautions, it was downgraded. Essentially, I'm using that word, but that's what happened at the scene, didn't it?
That decision was made based on the intelligence and information that I had at that time.
Well, you had, but the intelligence you had included that it might be hazardous.
Yes, sir.
Yes. And that takes priority, doesn't it, as the officer, Mr. Mills, said only a day or so ago. That takes priority when you have your meeting. If there might be a danger to the public, you err on the side of caution, correct?
From all I can repeat, sir, is what I said. All the information I had and intelligence that I had didn't point to that.
Yes, I understand that you had intelligence of a different kind. But it doesn't outweigh those who have specific information, does it?
If someone had come to me with specific information, sir, that would have been added into the mix of information.
The specific information that was available to you came from the paramedics, didn't it?
As I said, sir, I got that second hand.
I think both of you have got the point.
Yes. One last person involved in this. I want to deal with you managed to contact all the commanders, you say?
Yes, I did.
Is there any record of this conversation other than in your statement?
Not by me.
Not by you?
No.
You see, the position in that meeting was that the ambulance commander at that time, and Mr. Tilsley, whose name's come up before, he didn't agree with what you were doing, did he?
I honestly can't remember whether he agreed or not. All I can remember that he was quite accepting of it, sir.
I'm sorry, I want this to be important for the future again.
Yes.
Are you obliged at some point to make a record of the meeting?
Only in my own notes or in here, in my statement.
Yes, I just wanted to ask whether there's any protocol suggesting if you're going to take decision between commanders, whether at the time somebody, doesn't have to be you, actually makes a note, if not of the discussion, at least of the outcome of it all. Doesn't somebody have to do that?
No, but it's recorded onto the police log, I believe, sir.
You see, what's in your statement doesn't actually tell us much about what the commanders actually said, does it?
No, it doesn't.
No. Why is that?
Honestly can't remember, sir.
Sorry?
I honestly can't remember, sir.
Sorry, I want to be clear. You can't remember why you didn't put it in the statement?
No, all I can remember is that we had what people are describing as the huddle, and after that conversation, it was decided to treat this as a drugs overdose.
You decided to treat it. Is that fair?
Yes.
Yes. And this is why I suggest to you it's a most unsatisfactory situation that you take charge of a situation where the information is specific. That is not acceptable, is it?
The information, there was a lot of information and intelligence, and
Yes, all right. Because we have to, in your case, the same point. You're not medically qualified, are you?
Certainly not, no.
There was no training before Amesbury about Novichok, what it looks like.
No, sir.
So when you went in, you wouldn't know what to look for anyway,
No, I wouldn't.
or whether it could even be detected by the naked eye.
That's correct.
Right. And you certainly weren't trained in how to distinguish the impact or effects of an overdose as opposed to Novichok itself. So you weren't trained in that.
That's correct.
And were you by any chance aware of the fact that Novichok might still be in the vicinity?
No, I wasn't, sir.
You weren't. Well, does it surprise you to learn that, in fact, that was the thinking of some police and searches were going on? Had nobody told you?
There was searches, sir. Yes, going on.
Well, what do you think they were looking for?
Well, absolutely, they were looking for Novichok.
Yes. So did it occur to you, never mind everything else, that actually you've got the ambulance team as a whole, because they all agreed it in the end, talking about previous incidents, Salisbury, Novichok, and you know they're searching for it. Did it not occur to you, oh, this could be related?
Yes, sir.
You did. So that's another reason I suggest to you why you should have put precautions in place rather than taking them away. Do you follow?
I follow, sir, but as I go back to what I said before.
All right. Because it extends beyond what you didn't know. Before you got there and started taking decisions, you didn't know, did you, that the two or any of the paramedics inside the building had anything to do with Salisbury?
No, I didn't.
No, you didn't. You didn't even know the paramedics, presumably.
No, I didn't know them.
No. And you hadn't seen the patient,
No, I hadn't.
so you didn't know what the signs were.
No, sir.
So when it comes to taking a decision, your decision was taken on intelligence based on nobody who was inside the premises.
It was based on the information and intelligence that I had at the time, sir.
Yes, the answer I think is yes. It was, as it were, founded on material from people who were not in the premises. I can go through it, but I'll take it quickly. Even the doctor who spoke, he wasn't in the premises either, was he?
No, sir.
He wasn't talking about the patient that was being dealt with when you came along, was he?
That's correct.
Do you now appreciate, I've gone through the sequence, there's quite a lot of stages, admittedly you have to take them quickly, that you just put to one side.
I didn't put anything to one side, sir. Everything goes into my risk assessment and working strategy.
Yes, I appreciate. So for the future, are we right in saying that the only, going back to the beginning, the only lesson that you've learned, you say, out of all of this, is that the JESS meetings are now in place, but even they wouldn't have changed what happened on the night. Is that fair?
Yes, sir.
That's how you see it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mansfield. Is there anything else?
No, sir, that concludes the evidence for today and for the week.
Mr. Beresford-Smith, thank you very much for your help. We can let you go.
Thank you, sir.
And we can let everybody go at a respectable hour this evening. We'll reconvene, please, not next week, but the week afterwards, Monday the 28th of October, and not here, but at the IDRC in London. You'd probably like me to say, Mr. O'Connor, Miss Whitelaw, that we've been well looked after here. It's been, I dare say, very disruptive for Salisbury and for the Guildhall to have us here. And I'm conscious that I'm only looking at part of what is here. But if I may say so, it's all been managed very nicely, and it's been a great help to me, and I hope to you. in managing the job that we've all got to do. So thank you, Salisbury, and thank you to the Guildhall. Monday the 28th of October, please. 10 o'clock.